By August 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan, one of the largest cities on Earth, lay in ruins. Its causeways were choked with the dead, its canals ran with them, and the empire that had ruled central Mexico for a century was finished. History remembers one name above all others for this, Hernán Cortés. But Cortés did not do this alone, and the people who marched beside him did not see themselves as conquered. Many of them saw themselves as finally, after generations, getting even. This is the story of a war that has been called a conquest by one people and a liberation by several others, and a question that still splits historians today. If you appreciate this type of content, gently tap that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. To understand how a few hundred Spaniards ended an empire of millions, the story has to start with the empire itself. The Aztec, more precisely, the Mexica, ruled through a system built on tribute, not integration. Conquered cities kept their own rulers and their own gods, so long as they paid in gold, cotton, cacao, feathers, and food, and supplied a quota of captives destined for sacrifice at Tenochtitlan's temples. For the families living under that system, the fear was never abstract. A son might be conscripted for war, a neighbor selected as tribute in kind, feeding a demand for captives whose hearts were offered to the gods atop the Templo Mayor, before a vast rack of skulls, the Tzompantli, standing on public display. 16th century Spanish chroniclers wrote of towers built from as many as 130,000 skulls, numbers historians long dismissed as colonial exaggeration meant to justify conquest. Archaeological excavations beneath modern Mexico City, uncovering hundreds of real skulls at the base of the Templo Mayor, have since confirmed the practice was real and large in scale, even as most historians still regard the most extreme 16th century figures, such as the 80,000 supposedly sacrificed over 4 days at one temple dedication, as logistically impossible and likely inflated. It was an empire held together by fear and obligation rather than loyalty, and some of its subject cities had been trying to break free for decades. One confederation, the Tlaxcalans, had never been conquered at all, surrounded, cut off from trade, and fighting the Aztecs for generations, but never brought fully to heel. Somewhere between colonial propaganda and buried stone lies the truth. A family with a son who could be conscripted, or a neighbor who could be taken, had every reason to want this arrangement to end. That fear is the ledger against which any talk of Tlaxcalan or Totonac liberation has to be weighed. There is a second question worth asking before going further. Why was Hernán Cortés even there? He was not sent by his king. In 1518, the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, appointed Cortés to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland, officially to trade, explore, and search for stranded Christian captives, with colonization explicitly forbidden until the crown granted proper authority. Cortés had mortgaged nearly everything he owned to help fund the voyage. Then, days before departure, Velázquez changed his mind. He had grown suspicious of his own commander's ambition and tried to strip him of the command. Cortés sailed anyway, in open defiance of the man who had appointed him, turning an expedition into what was, by the letter of Spanish law, closer to a mutiny than a mission. He would spend the next 2 years writing directly to King Charles V over Velázquez's head, justifying, after the fact, an invasion nobody in Spain had actually ordered. Whatever else Cortés was, he was not a man following instructions. He was a minor gentleman from Extremadura, chasing gold, status, and a title no one had offered him. And the war that followed was, from its first hour, as much a gamble for his own survival as it was any kind of crusade. Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico in 1519 and found this fracture almost immediately. Along the Gulf Coast, the Totonac people complained bitterly that Aztec tribute collectors had picked their country clean and that their children had been taken for sacrifice. Within weeks, Cortés had persuaded the Totonacs to defy Moctezuma openly, the first Aztec subjects to do so in living memory. It was a preview of what was coming. The larger prize was Tlaxcala, and it did not come easily. When Cortés marched toward Tlaxcalan territory in September 1519, he was met not with alliance, but with an army that outnumbered his own by a staggering margin. For weeks, the Tlaxcalans fought the Spanish column with everything they had. Only after heavy losses on both sides, and after Tlaxcalan leaders concluded that an alliance against their ancient enemy served them better than a fight to the last man, did the two sides come to terms. In exchange for military support, Cortés offered the Tlaxcalans something they had wanted for 100 years, freedom from tribute, and the chance to help destroy the empire that had encircled them. The historian Matthew Restall has argued that this alliance, and others like it, did more to determine the outcome of the war than anything the Spanish brought with them. That what happened in Mexico was not a few hundred men defeating an empire, but a native rebellion, in which, as Restall puts it, Spaniards tended also to be outnumbered by their own native allies. That alliance had a price, and it was paid almost immediately. On the road to Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his new Tlaxcalan allies stopped in the city of Cholula, a wealthy religious center allied to the Aztecs. What happened next is disputed in nearly every detail. Cortés later wrote to King Charles V that he had uncovered a plot to ambush his men and struck first, killing several thousand in a matter of hours. Indigenous accounts, including those gathered later by the friar Bernardino de Sahagun, describe unarmed nobles and commoners summoned to a courtyard under false pretenses and slaughtered where they stood, with Tlaxcalan warriors let into the city once the killing began, joining in the destruction that followed. The eyewitness Bernal Diaz del Castillo, marching with Cortés, later defended the massacre as a necessary blow against treachery. Others among the Spanish themselves, including the friar Bartolomé de las Casas, called it exactly what it looked like, a massacre of people who had not raised a weapon. From Cholula, the road to Tenochtitlan was open. Cortés entered the Aztec capital in November 1519 and was received remarkably without a fight. Moctezuma had concluded, after months of failed attempts to turn the Spanish back, that hosting them was safer than resisting them. That calculation would prove fatal. Within months, the alliance collapsed into open war. Moctezuma was dead, and the Spanish were driven from the city in a single catastrophic night. It was Tlaxcala that gave the survivors refuge, and it was a Tlaxcalan army, alongside Spanish steel and a smallpox epidemic that killed Aztec nobility and commoners alike, that returned to besiege Tenochtitlan for 80 days, until the city fell in August 1521. By the final siege, Cortés commanded perhaps a few hundred Spaniards. He commanded tens of thousands of native allies. So who ended the Aztec Empire? Cortés himself never denied the debt. His own letters to the crown described Tlaxcalan warriors doing much of the fighting and dying. But he also wrote the version of the story that reached Europe first, and for 400 years that version left the Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, and every other native ally as background figures in someone else's triumph. Matthew Restall and other historians working from indigenous language sources have spent decades pushing back against that picture, arguing that this was, at its core, a native war against Aztec domination that the Spanish joined, exploited, and ultimately took credit for. Other historians caution against swinging too far the other way. The Spanish still supplied steel, horses, and a ruthlessness at Cholula that shaped what came after, and Tlaxcala's freedom from tribute, purchased under Spanish rule, looked, within a generation, very different from the freedom its leaders thought they were fighting for. Was Hernán Cortés a conqueror who destroyed a civilization, or a foreign general who lent his sword to a rebellion that was already generations in the making, one that used him as much as he used it? The Tlaxcalans, who marched into Tenochtitlan in 1521, believed, by every account we have, that they were finally settling a score. Whether what came after was liberation is a question the survivors on both sides spent the rest of their lives answering differently. This has been a production of History Recast. If you enjoyed this video, please click the link and check out one of our other stories.